Do you want to add more personality to your watercolor paintings? Let me show you how creative mark making can make a difference. Hi there, I'm Janine. I'm an artist and I share my creative journey on this channel. I used to paint mainly with watercolors because of the beautiful effects you can achieve. But then I started leaning into layering. So I switched to acrylics and I haven't used watercolor much at all in the last few years. Every now and then I do feel the need to experiment with watercolor though, and it often gives me ideas to translate into painting with acrylics. Today I want to experiment making marks with different tools that you don't typically would use with watercolors. I haven't used my watercolors in a long time, so I want to just play with some mark making to get sort of back into it. And I've got a couple of watercolors here in tubes. They're both Daniel Smith. This one's Naphtamide Maroon and this one is Potter's Pink. I've got a kind of oval wash brush, I think you'd call it. Well, it's called an oval wash brush. It's by Rowney. Then I've got a few mark making tools here, which I might use, I might not. This, what is it called? A rigger brush, sign painting brush, and silicone blade. Just from the hardware store, a 1-inch flat brush, and this color shaper. You could also use one of those silicone clay shaping tools. They work exactly the same and are much cheaper than this one. And then I've also got a few pencils here, which are the Stabilo Woodies in a light pink, brown and orange, and they're water soluble, so that might create some interesting effects. So I just want to create a wash first with the two watercolors. One thing I really like about watercolors is wet in wet. So I'm just going to wet the page a little bit first. And then I'm going to throw on some of this Naphtamide Maroon. I just kind of want to cover the whole page. Sort of a solid background. Already got some lovely marks here actually. Quite like that. Might make some more into the wet colour that's here now. Maybe make some areas a little bit darker. Some a little bit lighter. And then on this side I'm going to use that one, Potter's Pink, which I used to be obsessed with when I first got back into watercolors. I think this might have dried out a little bit actually. That's not great, is it? I think Potter's Pink is also one of those pigments that you can't really re-wet easily. Clearly haven't used this in a long time. See if we can work with that somehow. Let's create a little ball. Might have to just revert to using the Naphtamide Maroon on its own. What if I squeeze out a little bit more from further back? No, I think this is definitely dried up. What a shame. If you're wondering what the sketchbook is that I'm using, it's the Etchr square one. I think it's quite new. Oh, a little bit here. I think this might be a bit better, fresher. And then I'm going to let that dry. I think I can start already with some mark making over here. This is already quite dry. Right, let's start with maybe some of this orange. And one thing I always like to do is just little repetitive dotty marks and lines, but not too neat. Actually, let's just go in here while it's still wet as well. And as I said, these are water soluble and you could just re-wet them. Which now will also re-wet the background because obviously the watercolor is water soluble. Let's use this brown and maybe some random lines. Just dancing across the whole page. Just even more random marks, little dots. Just try and have fun and play with the materials. Let's try and use this light one. I wonder if that shows up. Maybe just make it more like a solid area.
If you like this video, consider subscribing.
It's quite interesting where the paint is still wet and it kind of moves it around at the edges. I've also been enjoying these weird M-shaped marks lately. Don't quite know what they're about. Also kind of twisting the pencil as you go. I still have some green in this palette, which I can't be certain, but I think it's the Hooker's Green by Schmincke. And it might even have some of the Naphtamide Maroon in it already. So I'll just add some water to that, and I'll use this sign painting brush, rigger brush, whatever it is. I'll try and link it down below for you. And then just do some lines first. Actually creates really interesting lines because you have very little control over it, especially if you just hold it loose like this. What about little dots? You can make very, very fine dots with this. Maybe more of a cluster of dots. That's the coffee machine downstairs. If you can hear that noise. Yeah, I really like that it makes super, super fine lines and also not controlled. I don't use this brush a lot, but I probably should, especially for smaller work, obviously. It wouldn't really show up very much in larger work. Then let's try this palette knife. Just literally dab it into my paint. And I've got a little bit more here, that's why it created like a big blob here and just a little bit there. And also I think the surface is still a bit wet, so it runs really lovely. You can also dip it in some water and then move that paint around. Oh, and you can obviously also move the water-soluble pencil here. Not a lot of water will stay on your silicone blade, obviously, when you dip it into the water, but it's just enough. A few more marks like that. Yeah, it picks it up really randomly because obviously the water beads up on the silicone. I really like that. It's very uncontrolled. Just what I'm all about. Then let's try, this is basically a smaller version. Don't know why I dipped that into the water. Let's dip it into the paint and then, oh, this works really well actually. Not for very long, not for a long distance. It's really nice in the wet surface, but it's still a bit damp.
Yeah, I like that. Actually, let's try this, the smaller side as well. Because it's got this, you see this kind of shorter side. It's got a long side and a shorter side here. So I'm trying that as well. Yeah, I did forget how much I really liked working with watercolor, just because it's so unpredictable. Like all this, where it was quite wet still, is all big mushy mess, which I love compared to the more defined marks. Yeah, so that worked surprisingly well. Did not expect that. And then lastly, let's use this just really cheap hardware brush. Could also probably just as well use a normal flat brush, a watercolor brush. Actually, let's maybe switch it up and use some of the Naphtamide Maroon. Put that in here. Mix a little bit of the green. Oh, I've already put that in water. Mix a tiny bit of the green into here to make it a bit darker. Actually, I do want some water. Some more water in here. A bit of the green just to make it a little bit more neutral. Oh, where it's quite dry, you see it creates these stripy marks. This is really interesting. Try and do a bit more of a solid mark. Well, now you use more of the surface of the actual brush, which I don't think is as successful. Maybe because I need more water. Let's use more water. More green. Yeah, it's quite nice when you've got it a bit more transparent. Just a little wash over some areas. Cool, I think that was more successful than I expected actually. I really love where it's blended into the wet surface, like here, and the two colors are kind of mixing at the edge. It's very hard to tell. And then I really love the softness of the watercolor in contrast to the more defined marks of the pencils. And I also really like where I went with the pencil through the wet paint, and then you kind of have the edges a lot more defined. I'll show you. So these light pink marks kind of have darker edges. That's really nice. And then obviously I love a good bit of wet in wet. And even here where I've dabbed the actual paint tube into the paint, I think that also adds a nice bit of subtle texture. And then where I've just covered a larger surface with the pencil, I also really like that in contrast to everything else. I just love when you experiment with your mark making and different tools, different materials, it really just adds so much variety to your painting, which then obviously adds much more interest. I actually really love the end result, and I love the variety I could achieve in my marks. Do you use watercolor, and do you like to experiment with unusual tools? Let me know in the comments below. I've also got a great tip for you for selecting a harmonious watercolor palette. Click the link to the video in the description box. Thanks and bye bye. But then I started leaning into layering, so I switched to acrylics. Shushi!